The Mojave Desert at 1 in the afternoon was not a place. It was a punishment. Heat radiated upward from the cracked asphalt in thick, visible waves, turning the distant mountains into something liquid and uncertain, as though the landscape itself had given up trying to hold its shape. The air smelled of baked earth and aviation fuel and the particular kind of silence that only exists in places where nothing is supposed to go wrong, but frequently does. Barstow Daggett Airport was not on anyone's list of destinations. It existed for crop dusters and charter puddle jumpers and the occasional military overflight that needed a place to set down without paperwork. The control tower was the size of a two-car garage. The single runway had a crack running diagonally across its midpoint that the county had been meaning to repair for 11 years. There was one fuel truck, one windsock, and one mechanic. The Gulfstream G650, sitting at the end of the taxiway, looked like a surgical instrument dropped into a junkyard. Inside the aircraft, the air conditioning was fighting a losing war against 112 degrees of desert conviction. Diana Caldwell stood at the front of the cabin with her phone pressed hard against her ear, her other hand gripping the back of a leather seat with enough force to whiten her knuckles. She was 38 years old, the chief executive of Caldwell Aerospace and Defense, and she had not been late to a meeting in 4 years. That record was now in the process of dying on a forgotten runway in the high desert of California. Fletcher, her voice carried the particular edge of someone who had learned early that volume was less effective than precision. Tell me what I am looking at in terms of timeline. Fletcher had been flying corporate jets for 19 years and had delivered bad news to powerful people on 5 continents. He still chose his words carefully. The starboard engine had thrown a bleed air fault code 30 minutes outside of Las Vegas. He had brought the aircraft down clean, no drama, but the FADEC had locked the engine out completely. The full authority digital engine control was doing exactly what it was designed to do, which was prevent a possible compressor stall from becoming a catastrophic turbine failure at altitude. The engine was not broken in any simple sense. The bleed air valve had failed mechanically. Until someone physically accessed the engine cell and addressed the fault, the aircraft was not going anywhere. The nearest Rolls-Royce certified response team was in Dallas. 6 hours, minimum. Diana set the phone on the seat beside her and looked out the oval window at the corrugated metal hangar baking at the far edge of the tarmac. A hand-painted sign hung above the open bay doors by a single bolt, swinging almost imperceptibly in the hot air. Hayes Aviation and Repair had been crossed out with black paint. Underneath, in different handwriting and a different era of optimism, Mercer Aviation Services. Fletcher appeared in the cabin doorway. There was a local mechanic on the field, he explained. Works on agricultural aircraft, private charters, some military surplus equipment that passes through. The airstrip manager says he knows turbofan engines. Says he's worked on everything. Diana looked at the hangar again. She looked at the time on her phone. The Apex Medical acquisition was scheduled to close at 5 o'clock in a boardroom on the 42nd floor of a San Francisco high-rise. $3.8 billion. 7 months of negotiations. A deal that would silence every member of her board who had whispered, since the day she inherited the company from her father, that she was too young, too aggressive, and too willing to bet the company on her own instincts. "Bring him over," she said. Garrison Mercer was lying on a creeper beneath the belly of a 1974 Piper Aztec when Fletcher's shadow fell across the hangar floor. He had been chasing a hydraulic leak in the left engine nacelle for the better part of 2 hours, and he was close enough to the answer that he didn't immediately move. He finished tightening the fitting by feel, gave it one more quarter turn with the wrench, then slid out from under the aircraft and sat up. He was 52, broad through the shoulders, with forearms that spoke to decades of work that required actual physical force. His face was weathered in the specific way of men who had spent years outdoors in conditions that were not designed for comfort. His eyes were a dark, settled gray, the kind that didn't move much even when the rest of his face did. There was a stillness to him that was not passivity. It was something trained into muscle and bone over a long period of time, then never fully released. On the worn couch against the hangar wall, Lily Mercer sat cross-legged with a spiral notebook open across her knees, working on a drawing with the focused intensity that 8-year-olds bring to things that matter to them. The portable oxygen concentrator beside her hummed its steady, mechanical rhythm. The clear nasal cannula rested lightly beneath her nose, its tubing looping down across her small chest. She had decorated the tubing with 3 small butterfly stickers, placed at equal intervals, which she had told her father improved the aerodynamics. Garrison stood, wiped his hands on a rag that was well past the point of usefulness, and looked at the man in the white uniform shirt standing at the edge of his hangar. His eyes moved past the pilot to the aircraft at the end of the taxiway, taking in its profile, its stance, the specific angle at which the starboard engine nacelle was sitting. Something shifted in his posture, barely perceptible, the way a doctor's expression changes in the moment before they speak. He grabbed his Pelican case without being asked. The walk across the tarmac was short, and the sun was direct and merciless. Diana Caldwell descended the air stairs as Garrison approached, flanked by 2 men in dark suits whose sunglasses and squared-off stillness communicated their function without ambiguity. She was dressed for a boardroom, not a desert. Charcoal blazer, silk blouse, heels that had no business on cracked asphalt. She looked at Garrison with the particular expression of someone who has been presented with a solution they find personally offensive. Her eyes moved across him the way an appraiser's eyes move across something offered at an inflated price. The oil on his forearms. The worn steel-toed boots with the left lace replaced by a different color. The smear of hydraulic fluid along his jaw that he had not noticed and would not have concerned himself with if he had. Fletcher? The name came out flat, aimed at the pilot rather than the man standing in front of her. This is a joke. Garrison stopped at the base of the stairs and waited. This man works on crop dusters. Diana's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. I wouldn't let him wash the windshield of this aircraft. Ma'am, Garrison's voice was unhurried and low. Your pilot says you have a bleed air fault. If it's the actuator pin, I can lock the valve manually, and you fly to San Francisco on 1 engine with no anti-ice on the starboard side. You land, you ground it. Rolls-Royce does a full inspection. You make your meeting. Diana looked at him steadily. Do you know what kind of engine that is? Rolls-Royce BR725A, 1-12. 16,900 pounds of thrust. Beautiful piece of engineering. Notorious for seizing the high-pressure pneumatic valves when the A-check lubrication gets skipped, which, given where you're standing right now, I'm guessing it did. There was a pause in which Diana reassessed something without showing it. She pulled out her phone and called Preston Donahue, her director of engineering, currently in the Caldwell offices in San Francisco. She put him on speaker. Donahue's voice came through confident and immediate. The bleed air valve on the BR725 was buried behind the thrust reverser cascade assembly. You needed a crane to pull the aft cowling. No field technician could physically reach it without proper equipment. Anyone who told her otherwise was either lying or dangerously uninformed. Your engineer is looking at a schematic. Garrison set his Pelican case on the ground and unlatched it. "I'm looking at the engine. He's right that you can't reach it from the outside without equipment. He doesn't know about the lower access panel and the bypass duct. Field repair, unorthodox, effective." "I'm not trusting my life to unorthodox." Diana's voice dropped to something quieter and more final. "Get away from my aircraft." Garrison picked up the case. 6 hours for the Dallas team. Your call." He turned and began walking back toward the hangar. Fletcher said something quietly to Diana. Whatever it was true enough to stop her. 500 an hour. Garrison said it without turning around. "Clock started when you landed." A long moment passed. The heat pressed down on everything. "Don't touch the upholstery," Diana said. He went through the cabin without looking at it, through the walnut panels and the cream leather and the faint smell of expensive perfume, straight into the cockpit. He sat in the co-pilot seat, opened the Pelican case, and pulled out a ruggedized laptop that had been refurbished twice and was running diagnostic software he had written and modified himself over the course of several years. He connected it to the aircraft's maintenance port beneath the center console. Raw data began populating the screen, bypassing the aircraft's polished interface entirely. Diana stood in the cockpit doorway with her arms crossed. "You're connecting a 10-year-old laptop to a proprietary avionics network. The laptop is 9 years old." He didn't look up. "And your avionics network uses the same ARINC 429 data bus it used when it left the factory. Nothing proprietary about the maintenance port." She turned to the larger of the two security men. "Watch him." The data confirmed what Garrison had suspected from the moment he'd seen the aircraft's stance on the taxiway. The actuator pin on the bleed air valve had sheared. The valve was stuck open, flooding the manifold with hot compressed air, and the FADEC had done its job by locking the entire system out. There was no software fix. The pin was a piece of metal inside the engine, and it needed a human hand. He gathered his tools and went back out into the heat. He had the ladder set up and was sorting his wrenches when Diana came down the air stairs and walked toward him, still holding her phone. Her chief engineer in San Francisco had confirmed it again, she said. It was impossible without a crane. If Garrison tried to reach the valve through the bypass duct, he would likely sever a fuel line. She looked at him with the expression of someone presenting a final verdict. "I appreciate the second opinion," Garrison said, and climbed the ladder. He worked by feel in a space not designed for human arms. The engine cell was hot even hours after shutdown, radiating stored heat from its titanium and steel interior. He had to angle his right arm through the bypass duct at a specific angle, past the thrust reverser mechanism, navigating by memory of diagrams he had studied years ago in a context that had nothing to do with corporate aviation. His muscles strained against the confined geometry of the space. The edge of a heat shield found his bicep and opened a shallow cut that he didn't acknowledge. Below him, Diana had stopped pacing. She stood at the base of the ladder and watched. The hostility in her face had not disappeared, but it had been joined by something else, something reluctant and involuntary. The man's arm was buried to the shoulder in an engine her own chief engineer had declared inaccessible. He was working entirely by feel, and he was calm in the way that only people who have done frightening things in worse conditions can be calm. The valve gave way with a metallic groan that Garrison felt more than heard, a deep-seated resistance surrendering at once. He threaded the locking pin into place, confirmed it twice by touch, and pulled his arm free. The edge of the heat shield caught the fabric of his right sleeve as he withdrew. The denim tore from cuff to shoulder with a sound like a gunshot, the entire sleeve hanging in strips. Blood ran freely from the cut on his bicep. He wrapped the torn fabric around it without looking at it and began descending the ladder. "Fault won't return," he said, reaching the ground. "Tell your pilot to clear the code. You can fly." Deanna was not looking at the engine. She was not looking at the blood. She was looking at his right forearm, now fully exposed in the savage Mojave sunlight. The tattoo was old and had blurred slightly at the edges the way ink does after a decade against skin that has worked hard and aged in the sun. But the design was specific and unmistakable. A dagger piercing a winged skull, a ribbon beneath it carrying letters and numbers that had been burned into her memory on a night she had spent years and considerable money trying to locate the source of Ghost. 3/75 RGR TF Damascus 2018. The desert air seemed to stop moving entirely. Deanna Caldwell had been 30 years old in a concrete basement in eastern Syria, chained to a pipe, when the door had come off its hinges in a single percussive event that she had initially mistaken for an airstrike. A large man in full kit and night vision optics had pulled her to her feet with a certainty of purpose that had cut through her shock like a blade. When a figure had appeared in the doorway behind them, the man had put himself between Diana and the weapon without hesitation, taking the round against his shoulder plate, and had put the threat down in the same motion. He had carried her to the extraction helicopter with one arm, wrapped his jacket around her shoulders without being asked, and pulled her aboard with his right hand extended, his sleeve riding up, the tattoo illuminated by the aircraft's strobe lighting for exactly 5 seconds before the door closed and they lifted out of the dark. The operation had been classified at a level that made private investigators useless. The unit had no official existence. The call sign had returned no results. She had been told, politely and then less politely, to stop asking. She was looking at the answer now. He was covered in engine grease and his own blood, and he was wrapping a torn sleeve around his arm with the practiced indifference of a man who had sustained far worse. Her voice, when it arrived, was barely audible. "Your ghost." Garrison's hands went still. He turned slowly and looked at her face, not at the designer clothes or the composed executive mask, but at the structure beneath it, the specific angle of her jaw, and the particular quality of her eyes when stripped of everything she normally kept in them. He placed her backward in time and geography, removed the polish and the authority and the 4 years of compounded stress, and put her back in a basement in a country that smelled of dust and cordite, the aid worker, the VIP extraction at Al-Raqqa. He had carried her out unconscious for the last 40 meters when her legs had stopped working. "That man's gone," Garrison said. His voice was flat and final and contained a grief that had nothing to do with drama. "I'm just Garrison Mercer, and your engine is fixed." Diana Caldwell, who had negotiated with defense ministers and dismantled 3 Fortune 500 subsidiaries and had not cried in front of another person in 6 years, pressed her hand flat against her sternum as though checking for structural damage. Her eyes filled without spilling, the tears held back by some last reserve of professional discipline that was visibly losing the argument. "I looked for you," she said. Garrison did not move for a long moment. He stood with the torn fabric pressed against his bicep, blood seeping through in a slow, dark bloom, and looked at Diana Caldwell the way a man looks at something he buried a long time ago and had genuinely believed would stay buried. The desert offered nothing in the way of mercy. The heat continued its indifferent work. The Gulf Stream sat silent behind her, its starboard engine cooling and locked, going nowhere for reasons that had nothing to do with mechanics anymore. "You hired private investigators," he said. It was not a question. Diana's hand dropped from her chest. 3 of them. The best firm in Washington. They told me the unit didn't exist. They told me the call sign was a fabrication. One of them suggested I had misremembered the details due to trauma, a pause that carried 6 years of frustration in it. I have never misremembered anything in my life. The classification was total. Garrison turned away and began gathering his tools from the base of the ladder, each movement deliberate, hands working while the rest of him processed. That was the point. We didn't exist on paper before the mission. We didn't exist after it. Anyone who looked got a wall and a polite suggestion to redirect their attention. I leveraged my father's Pentagon contacts. Her voice had lost its corporate precision, the syllables slightly unsteady at the edges. He knew people at the Joint Special Operations Command. They gave me nothing. They gave you exactly what they were authorized to give you. Garrison latched the Pelican case and straightened. The makeshift bandage on his arm had darkened but held. Which was nothing. Fletcher was standing at the top of the air stairs, pretending with considerable effort to be occupied with something on his tablet. The 2 security men had moved to a respectful distance that was not quite out of earshot but was close enough to function as a gesture. The desert had gone very quiet around a conversation that had no business happening on a cracked tarmac in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. Diana walked to the base of the stairs and sat down on the lowest step, which was not something anyone who knew her professionally would have predicted. The precision of her posture remained, bone deep and involuntary, but the authority she carried like a second skin had loosened around her shoulders. She asked him what had happened after Syria, not the official version, the real one. Garrison was quiet long enough that it seemed possible he would simply pick up his case and walk back to the hangar without answering. Then he sat on the wheel chock nearest the stairs, rested his forearms on his knees, and looked out at the flat white distance of the Mojave. The round that hit his shoulder plate in that basement had transferred enough kinetic energy into the ceramic to fracture 2 ribs and drive bone fragments into the muscle tissue. Minor in the operational context. He had finished the mission, made the extraction, and filed the debrief 40 hours later without mentioning it. What he had not been able to hide from the flight surgeon 3 weeks afterward was the nerve damage from shrapnel that had found the gap between plate and collar. 3 fragments, 2 removed successfully. 1 left in place near the L2 vertebra because the surgical risk of removal outweighed the alternative. Medical discharge, honorable, effective immediately. He had gone back to Nevada because Ellen was there. Because Ellen had been there through 2 previous deployments and a third that had lasted longer than either of them had expected and had changed him in ways that took years to fully inventory. She had learned to read the version of him that came home each time, the way you learn to read a landscape that shifts its geography slightly with each visit, but is still, fundamentally, yours. The illness announced itself quietly, the way serious things often do. A persistent cough that Ellen attributed to the dry air, a weight loss that she attributed to stress. The diagnosis arrived in 2019, 14 months after Garrison had hung up the last of his gear and started taking on repair work at the airstrip because it was the only kind of work his hands remembered how to do, and because the sound of aircraft engines was the closest thing to familiar that civilian life had offered him. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 3 at discovery. He stopped there. Not from unwillingness, but from the particular economy of men who have learned that certain facts carry their own weight without additional language. Ellen had fought with the same methodical determination she had brought to everything in her life. She had also held Lily through the nights when the pulmonary hypertension announced itself in the small hours with a breathlessness that neither of them had words for yet. Ellen died in the spring of 2020. Lily was 4 years old. The words landed on the desert air and stayed there. Diana looked at Lily, visible through the open hangar doors 60 yards away, still bent over her notebook, the concentrator beside her doing its quiet and necessary work. The butterfly stickers on the tubing caught the afternoon light. The pulmonary hypertension, Diana said carefully. Congenital, no relation to Ellen. A brief pause. Just the universe being thorough. Diana looked at the ground between her feet. Whatever she was thinking moved through her face in a way she didn't bother to suppress, which told Garrison more about the last few minutes than anything she had said out loud. Inside the hangar, Lily had set down her pencil and was looking out at her father with the alert, patient quality of a child who has learned to read adult conversations from a distance. She raised one hand in a small wave. Garrison raised 2 fingers in return, the minimal gesture of a man who communicates sufficiency without excess. Diana pulled out her encrypted satellite phone and called her COO in San Francisco. The voice on the other end was immediately and audibly stressed. The board was in the conference room. The Apex representatives had been waiting for 40 minutes. Another hour, and the lead negotiator was going to walk to the airport. Diana looked at Lily. Pull the full asset breakdown for Apex Medical, she said. I need the core technology portfolio, everything they hold, not the summary sheet. The actual patents and product lines. A pause. Then, from the phone, the Apex Pediatric Pulmonary Bypass System. Proprietary design. No direct competitor in the current market. FDA approved for patients under 12. The only device of its kind cleared for the specific pressure management requirements of severe pediatric pulmonary hypertension cases. Garrison's head came up. The movement was small and involuntary, the kind that happens before the conscious mind has finished processing what the ears have delivered. His eyes moved to Diana's face with a new quality of attention, something stripped of the professional wariness he had maintained since she stepped off the aircraft. Diana ended the call. The silence between them was different now. It had a different weight and a different texture from the silence of strangers on a hot tarmac arguing about a broken engine. This silence knew things. The device your daughter needs, Diana said. She said it quietly and without flourish, the way you say something when you want the fact itself to do the work. Dr. Bryce at UCLA told me about it 8 months ago. Garrison's voice was level in the way a structure is level when it is working hard to remain so. $420,000, outside what insurance will cover for experimental applications, outside what I will ever accumulate working on agricultural aircraft in the Mojave Desert. Diana stood. She walked 3 paces out into the tarmac and stopped with her back to him, looking at nothing in particular, and was still for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then she turned around. She called her COO back. Her voice had recovered all its precision, the personal register sealed back behind the professional one with the efficiency of long practice, though something had shifted in the calibration. She told him to pull the Apex deal off the table as currently structured. She wanted a full acquisition, not a merger. Cash purchase. She wanted the apex chief of medical technology on a call within the hour, and she wanted the head of the UCLA Pediatric Cardiology Department contacted directly by the Caldwell legal team before end of business today. The COO's silence on the other end was the specific silence of someone doing rapid arithmetic on implications. Diana spoke before he could finish the calculation. And I need a full personnel package drafted, executive level, director of aviation safety. Pull the compensation band for VP of operations and add 15%. Full benefits, 0 deductible, immediate enrollment for all dependents. Have it ready when I land. She ended the call and looked at Garrison. He was already shaking his head. The movement was slow and certain. The refusal of a man who has survived enough charity to know the difference between its faces. I bill $500 an hour, he said. We were out here 40 minutes. You owe me $330, nothing else. What I owe you cannot be invoiced. Diana's voice was direct and without apology. 8 years ago, you put yourself between me and a weapon I didn't see coming. You took that impact, so I didn't. I have been trying to find a way to acknowledge that debt for every day of those 8 years. I am not offering you charity, Garrison. I am offering you the only proportionate response I am capable of making. Garrison stood and picked up his case. My daughter's health care is not a proportionate response to a tactical decision made in a basement in Syria. That was the job. He looked at her steadily. I didn't pull you out of that building so you would feel obligated to me. I pulled you out because you were a civilian in a kill zone, and leaving you there was not an option. I know that. Diana held his gaze without blinking. That's exactly why it matters. From the hangar, Lily's voice carried across the tarmac with the uncomplicated carrying power of a child who has not yet learned to modulate for adult uncertainty. She had finished her drawing and wanted to show her father. The concentrator bumped along the asphalt behind her as she walked, its wheels catching in the cracks. Garrison watched her come, and something in his face did what it only did when she was near. The deep-seated tension releasing by a degree that was visible if you were paying attention. Diana was paying attention. Lily reached her father and held up the notebook. She had drawn the Gulf Stream with considerable accuracy for its size, the engines rendered as large circles with smaller circles inside them, and beside the aircraft, 2 figures of notably different heights. The shorter one had a small tube drawn from its nose in a careful curved line. The taller one had shoulders that took up a disproportionate amount of the page, which Lily appeared to consider realistic. Lily looked up at Diana with the frank, unguarded assessment of a child who has not yet learned to pretend she is not looking. Are you the lady whose plane broke? I am. Diana crouched to Lily's level, the charcoal blazer not designed for the posture, but managing it. Your father fixed it. Lily considered this with the gravity it deserved. He fixes everything, she said, with a matter-of-factness that carried the full weight of accumulated experience. That's just what he does. Garrison put his hand on the top of Lily's head briefly, the gesture wordless and complete. Diana stood. She looked at Garrison over Lily's head with an expression that had moved past the professional register entirely, past the executive certainty she had walked off that aircraft wearing into something unguarded and genuine, and not entirely comfortable for a woman who had built her adult identity around knowing exactly what she was going to do next. She did not repeat the offer. She did not argue with his refusal. What she did was pull a card from the inside pocket of her blazer and hold it out to him. Plain card stock. Direct line only. No title. The number had a San Francisco area code. Garrison looked at the card for a moment before taking it. Fletcher appeared at the top of the stairs and confirmed the fault code had cleared. The aircraft was ready. Diana climbed the stairs without looking back, which took a specific kind of effort that Garrison recognized without naming. At the top of the stairs, she paused with her hand on the door frame. "Phantom doesn't survive the kind of thing you survived by accident," she said, without turning around. "Neither does a man who raises a child like that alone. Whatever you think you are now, Garrison, the man who walked out of that building with me is still in there somewhere." The door closed. The hydraulics hissed. Garrison stood on the tarmac and watched the Gulfstream taxi to the runway. Lily slipped her hand into his and leaned against his arm, watching with him. The concentrator hummed beside her. The aircraft rotated and lifted clean into the white Mojave sky, banking northwest toward San Francisco, toward a $3.8 billion acquisition that was now going to be structured around a specific line item that its seller did not yet know was the most important asset in the portfolio. Garrison stood there until it was gone. Then he looked down at the business card in his hand, then at Lily, who was already pulling him back toward the hangar, already talking about the drawing, already planning what she would add to it. The unbroken forward motion of a child who has not yet learned to look back. He pocketed the card and let himself be pulled. 3 days passed before Diana came back. Garrison had not expected her to come back at all. The card sat on the workbench beside his coffee mug, and a torque wrench and a folded invoice from the county for runway maintenance fees that the airstrip tenants were being asked to split 6 ways, which worked out to a number Garrison did not have and was not going to have before the due date. He looked at the card occasionally, the way you look at something that hasn't decided what it is yet. He did not call the number. On the second day, he got a certified letter from UCLA Medical confirming that Lily's next specialist appointment had been moved up by 6 weeks due to a referral escalation initiated by the hospital's administrative office. The letter cited new insurance pre-authorization activity on Lily's account. Garrison read the letter twice, set it down, and went back under the Piper Aztec, where the hydraulic system had developed a second opinion about the repair he'd completed the week before. On the third day, a silver rental car pulled onto the tarmac at 2 in the afternoon. Not a car service, not a security detail. Diana Caldwell got out alone, wearing dark jeans and a white button-down with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and walked across the cracked asphalt toward the hangar with the deliberate stride of someone who has made a decision and is not interested in reconsidering it on the way. Garrison slid out from under the aircraft before she reached the door. He sat up and looked at her and did not say anything, which was a form of question she apparently understood. She had restructured the Apex acquisition, she said. Full purchase, cash. Closed that morning. The Apex Pediatric Pulmonary Bypass System was now a Caldwell medical asset, and the lead engineer on its development was under a 2-year contract that included a clinical deployment partnership with UCLA's Pediatric Cardiology Unit. Dr. Bryce had been contacted. Lily's case had been formally reviewed. The device could be implanted within the month pending one additional workup. She said all of this, standing at the edge of the hangar in the flat afternoon light, not as an announcement, but as a statement of fact, the way you report the completion of a task. Garrison looked at his hands. The silence that followed was not comfortable, but it was honest. He had spent 2 days preparing a version of himself that would refuse this, that would find the principled language for declining something this large from someone he had known for 40 minutes on a broken runway. That version of himself was losing the argument badly, and both of them could see it. Lily was at school. The hangar was quiet except for the ticking of cooling metal and the distant sound of a crop duster making its third pass over the alfalfa fields to the east. "I won't be managed," Garrison said finally. "I'm not interested in managing you." Diana leaned against the door frame, arms crossed, but without the armor the gesture had carried the first time. "I'm interested in putting the best person I've encountered in aviation safety into a role that currently has a mediocre person in it. Those two things happen to benefit both of us. That's not charity. That's just efficiency." He looked at her for a long moment. "Who's the mediocre person?" "Preston Donahue, director of engineering, has held the position for 6 years, has never once identified a systems fault before it manifested in the field, and spent 45 minutes on the phone last Tuesday insisting that a repair you completed in 20 minutes was physically impossible." A brief pause. "I'm not firing him immediately, but I need someone in that building who knows what they're looking at." Garrison stood and walked to the open hangar door, looking out at the runway. The rental car sat in the white heat, slightly out of place, like its driver. He said no. Diana said she would come back tomorrow. He said she shouldn't bother. She came back the following evening, this time arriving 40 minutes before sunset, when the Mojave light goes gold and horizontal and briefly forgives the landscape for everything it puts you through during the day. She brought 2 coffees from the gas station 12 miles up the highway, which was the only option for 40 miles in any direction, and handed one to Garrison without comment. They sat on the step outside the hangar's side door, where a rusted metal awning provided 4 feet of shade, and the conversation that happened was different from the ones before it. The negotiations were not entirely absent, but they had receded enough to allow other things into the space. Diana talked about her father, not the founder of Caldwell version, the version that appeared in the authorized company history and the memorial conference room on the 14th floor. The real version, a man who had loved aircraft with a purity that bordered on the impractical, who had kept a 1962 Beechcraft Bonanza in a hangar in Marin that he flew every Sunday until the FAA grounded him at 71 for a cardiac condition he had been quietly managing for 3 years without telling anyone, including his cardiologist, who had handed his company to his daughter 6 months before he died, because he trusted her judgment more than he trusted the board's, and had not lived long enough to see how much pressure that trust was going to be required to survive. Garrison listened without interruption, which was the only kind of listening he had ever done well. He told her about Ellen's habit of leaving handwritten notes in his gear before deployments, small folded squares of paper tucked into pockets he wouldn't find until he was already somewhere else, messages calibrated to the specific deployment and the specific version of him she expected to come home. He had saved all of them in a fireproof box under the workbench, the same box that held Lily's birth certificate and his discharge papers and the photograph taken at the extraction LZ in Syria that he had not looked at in 4 years. Diana did not say anything when he finished. She looked at the runway and drank her gas station coffee, and the quality of her silence was the quality of someone who understands that certain things are offered once and should not be responded to with words. When the light went completely, she stood and said she would have the employment package sent to his email. He could review it, modify whatever he thought was unreasonable, and send it back. Or not. The offer would remain open for 2 weeks. Garrison watched her car until the taillights disappeared past the highway junction. He called her the next morning and said he would take the job. The apartment Caldwell secured for Garrison and Lily in the Sunset District of San Francisco was not large, but it had a bay window that faced west and caught the afternoon light in a way that Lily immediately identified as the correct location for her drawing table. She arranged it there herself, pushing it into place with the focused determination of someone establishing the terms of a new territory. The oxygen concentrator went beside it, tugged from its previous corner by its wheeled base. The butterfly stickers on its tubing now joined by two new ones she had added during the drive up from the desert, a dragonfly and something that might have been a star. Garrison put Ellen's photograph on the kitchen windowsill the first night, where it would catch the morning light. He stood in front of it for a moment before unpacking anything else, a brief and private accounting with a woman who had been making silent arguments to him across the distance of 4 years, most of which he was only now beginning to answer. The Caldwell Aerospace Building occupied the upper 12 floors of a glass tower on Beale Street, 3 blocks from the Embarcadero. The lobby was marble and climate-controlled to a temperature that communicated serious intentions. The aviation division occupied floors 38 through 42, and the Maintenance Operations Center on 39 was where Garrison spent his first morning, working through the fleet documentation with the systematic attention of someone who is looking not for what is recorded, but for what isn't. Preston Donahue met him on the second day. Donahue was 51, trim and well-dressed in the particular way of engineers who have spent more time in conference rooms than hangars, with a handshake that was firm in the practiced, deliberate manner of a man who has read about the importance of firm handshakes. He smiled at Garrison with all the warmth of a building's structural inspection report and gave him a tour of the operations center that was thorough and revealed nothing. Donahue's assistant brought coffee. Donahue spoke knowledgeably about the fleet, the maintenance schedules, the vendor relationships, the regulatory compliance record. He used the word proactive 4 times in 11 minutes. He did not once mention the faulty pressure sensor on the tail assembly of Aircraft 7 that Garrison had noticed in the fleet documentation that morning, listed under a maintenance deferral code that meant someone had seen it, assessed it as non-critical, and signed off on continued operations. When Donahue finished his tour and extended his hand again, his smile carrying the particular complacency of a man who considered the conversation to have gone well, Garrison shook it without expression. That evening, in the operations center after the floor had cleared, Garrison pulled the full maintenance histories for all 14 aircraft in the Caldwell fleet. He read through them with the overhead fluorescents on and his cold coffee beside him and the specific quality of attention that finds things which are not supposed to be found. He was there until 11:45. He found 3. The first was the pressure sensor deferral on Aircraft 7, signed off 8 months ago by Donahue personally. The second was a recurring hydraulic anomaly on Aircraft 11 that had been addressed by replacement of the external sensor rather than inspection of the hydraulic line itself, twice, 14 months apart, with Donahue's initials on both service records. The third was subtler, a pattern in the engine cycle logs on Aircraft 3 that indicated thermal stress accumulation in the turbine section at a rate inconsistent with the aircraft's reported flight hours, which meant either the hours were wrong or the thermal management had been operating outside parameters for an extended period, neither of which was a conclusion that led anywhere comfortable. He wrote a report. He gave it to Diana the following morning, printed, with the source documentation attached. She read it at her desk while he stood and watched her face move through its registers without giving much away. Then she set it on her desk and looked at him. How long have these been accumulating? The hydraulic issue on 11 goes back at least 14 months based on the service records. The turbine data on 3, I'd need another week to fully characterize. The pressure sensor on 7 is the most immediate. That aircraft is scheduled for a charter flight on Friday. Diana picked up her phone and grounded Aircraft 7 before Garrison had reached the elevator. That evening, she found him in the maintenance bay on the building's 4th floor, where the Caldwell fleet's non-flight equipment was stored, and where Garrison had established a working space with the organized efficiency of a man who knows where he needs every tool before he needs it. She leaned in the doorway and watched him work for a moment before she spoke. She asked about Ellen, not the facts, which she already had. The person. Garrison set down the inspection light and considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Ellen had been the kind of person who remembered the names of waitstaff and asked about their lives and remembered the answers the next time, who had kept a vegetable garden in their small backyard in Reno with the seasonal commitment of someone tending something sacred, who had read to Lily every night from the day Lily came home from the hospital, starting with the same book she had been reading to her in the womb on the theory that continuity of narrative was important even when the audience couldn't yet process the words. He paused there, looking at the inspection light in his hand. She would have found this building completely absurd, he said. The marble, the 42 floors. She would have asked why anyone needed 42 floors to fix airplanes. Diana laughed. It was a real laugh, short and unguarded, and it changed her face entirely. She covered it quickly with the back of her hand in a gesture that seemed less about composure and more about surprise at herself. The conversation ran until the building's cleaning crew arrived at 9, and they relocated it to the lobby, and then to the coffee place across the street that was still open. And by the time it ended, Garrison understood that Diana Caldwell had been operating at a sustained altitude of professional isolation for 4 years, since her father's death, and the inheritance of a company whose board considered her provisional, and whose employees were still calibrating whether she was the real thing or a temporary weather system. He understood this without her stating it directly, which was the only way she was capable of stating anything that cost her something. The charter went on without Aircraft 7, rescheduled with Aircraft 9. The clients never knew. Diana did not tell the board the reason for the swap. The work settled into a rhythm over the following weeks that Garrison had not expected and did not examine too closely. The fleet documentation improved daily. Marcus was developing the diagnostic instincts that Donahue's supervision had spent 18 months suppressing. Fletcher had quietly become the operations center's most reliable source of institutional intelligence, delivered in texts of 5 words or fewer. The building, which had felt like a foreign country on the first morning, had begun to feel like something he understood. It was on a Thursday evening, after the Aircraft 11 incident had been documented and filed and the floor had finally cleared, that Garrison called Lily from the lobby while waiting for a car. She told him about school, about a math problem that had been presented incorrectly by the teacher and that she had corrected, about a girl named Amber who had asked about the oxygen concentrator, and Lily had explained it using the phrase atmospheric pressure differential, which she had picked up from listening to Garrison's radio calls, and which Amber had apparently found impressive. The dragonfly sticker, Lily reported, was starting to peel. He told her he would pick her up in 40 minutes. He told her they would stop for tacos. The place on Irving she had identified as the best in the neighborhood, based on a survey she had conducted over 2 weekends that involved rating criteria she had developed herself and had not fully shared with him yet. He was smiling when he ended the call. It was the kind of smile that happens below the level of intention, before the face has received the instruction. In his pocket, his phone vibrated. A text from an unknown number that resolved, when he opened it, to the Caldwell Board's general communications line. 7 words. We need to discuss your employees' qualifications. Garrison read the message once, pocketed the phone, and walked out into the fog toward the car. The text from the board's general communications line sat in Garrison's pocket like a piece of shrapnel. Not painful yet, just present. The kind of thing you know is going to require attention before it requires emergency attention, and the window between those two states is shorter than it appears. He picked up Lily. They got tacos, Lily's rating system, which she finally explained over carnitas and horchata at a table by the window, involved 5 criteria weighted by importance: tortilla structural integrity under filling load, salsa temperature consistency between first and last bite, protein to vegetable ratio, staff responsiveness to the oxygen concentrator without making it a whole thing, and what she described as overall atmosphere of not being weird about us. The place on Irving had scored 44 out of 50 on her first visit and 46 on the second, with the improvement attributed to a different staff member who had simply moved a chair without being asked to make room for the concentrator and then gone back to work. Garrison listened to all of this with the full attention he brought to structural analysis and radio communications. Lily noticed, the way she always noticed. It was one of the things about her that had occasionally startled him since she was very small. The quality of her observation, the way she cataloged not just what people said, but what their attention was doing while they said it. "You got a bad text," she said. He looked at her across the table. "Your jaw did the thing," she said. "It does the thing when something is bad, but you're deciding not to be upset about it yet." He told her it was work. She accepted this with the equanimity of a child who has learned that certain categories of adult concern resolve themselves without requiring her participation, and returned to her carnitas. He did not tell her about the board's message. He did not tell her that Donahue had spent 40 minutes in his private office after the Aircraft 11 incident on a call that Garrison had not been meant to observe, but had, from the stairwell window, through the glass partition, watching the body language of a man who was not reporting an incident but managing one. He did not tell her that the management reporter from the aviation trade publication had called the Caldwell Communications office that same afternoon, asking for confirmation of a story they were preparing about the company's hiring practices and the employment of personnel with classified military backgrounds and unverifiable credentials. Someone had made a call. The call had not been made by anyone who wanted the story to go well for Garrison. He took Lily home and sat with her while she added to the drawing she had started in the Mojave, which had grown considerably in scope over the weeks and now occupied 3 taped-together sheets of paper and included the Caldwell building, Aircraft 11 rendered in accurate profile, a figure at a radio console that Lily identified as her father, and a smaller figure in the corner of the page labeled in her careful printing as me, watching. The concentrator appeared in the drawing as well, rendered with careful detail, the butterfly stickers included, positioned beside the watching figure like a faithful and slightly mechanical companion. He read to her from the book Ellen had started, the same one, continued through the years with the same bookmark Ellen had placed in it, a laminated card from the Reno Botanical Garden that Lily had never removed and had never asked about, and had, Garrison believed, understood completely from the time she was old enough to understand anything. After Lily was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and the Caldwell fleet documentation and the cold remains of his coffee and worked until 1 a.m, completing the full turbine analysis on Aircraft 3 that he had estimated would take another week. It took 6 more hours because he did not stop. The finding was worse than the preliminary data had suggested. The thermal stress accumulation pointed to a maintenance protocol deviation that had been in place for at minimum 2 years, systemic rather than incidental. The kind of deviation that does not happen through oversight, but through a sustained decision to prioritize schedule over inspection depth. He sent the report to Diana at 1:14 in the morning with a subject line that said only, "Aircraft 3, ground immediately." Her response came at 1:22. "Done. Thank you." He closed the laptop and looked at Ellen's photograph on the windowsill. The kitchen light was low and the photograph was slightly in shadow, but he knew the image well enough that the shadow didn't matter. He said quietly, to the room and to her, and to the particular quality of silence in a small apartment where a child is sleeping soundly for the first time in longer than he could accurately measure, "I'm trying." The photograph did not answer. It didn't need to. The board meeting happened 4 days later. Garrison was not invited to attend, which told him the specific nature of what was being discussed. Diana went in at 9 in the morning. He knew this because Fletcher, who had been reassigned to the San Francisco hub after the Barstow incident and had developed a quiet, practical loyalty to Garrison that expressed itself in small, useful acts of information, sent him a one-line text at 8:57. "She's going in alone." Garrison spent the morning in the maintenance bay on the 4th floor, working through the Aircraft 3 inspection with 2 technicians who had quickly learned that the new director of aviation safety did not describe what he needed done and then leave. He was present for the work, his hands involved where his hands were useful, his attention distributed evenly between the technical task and the development of the 2 technicians' diagnostic instincts, which he approached as a project he considered as important as the inspection itself. Marcus, the younger of the 2 technicians, had been with Caldwell for 18 months and had the natural mechanical intuition that cannot be taught, only cultivated. He had been working under Donahue's supervision for all 18 of those months and had learned through the gradual process of institutional conditioning to find what the protocol told him to look for and not to look for anything else. 3 days working alongside Garrison had begun dismantling this habit at its foundation. At 11:40, Marcus found the deviation point in the turbine inspection record, the specific date on which the protocol depth had been reduced, and the specific sign-off that had authorized the reduction. He held the record out to Garrison without saying anything, which was the right instinct. Garrison looked at the sign-off. Donahue's initials. June of the previous year. He photographed the record with his phone and added it to the documentation file. Diana emerged from the board meeting at 12:30 with the particular composure of someone who has absorbed significant pressure in a confined space and has chosen to metabolize it in private. She came to the maintenance bay rather than her office, which told Garrison something about what she needed from the next 30 minutes that she was not going to say directly. She looked at the disassembled turbine section of Aircraft 3 on the workbench, and at the documentation spread across the secondary table, and at Marcus and the other technician, who read the room correctly and found reasons to be occupied at the far end of the bay. "They want you gone," she said. Garrison looked up from the turbine record. "I know. They're calling it a liability issue, unverifiable credentials, classified background, intervention in a commercial aviation emergency without explicit authorization." She leaned against the workbench with her arms crossed, not the aggressive posture it had been on the Mojave tarmac, but the posture of someone holding themselves together at a seam. "Donahue has provided them with a formal complaint to the FAA filed yesterday. I saw it coming when he left the operations center without filing his own incident report." Garrison set down the turbine record. "He's protecting himself. The complaint about me is the mechanism, not the motivation." Diana looked at the sign-off photograph on his phone screen when he held it up. She looked at it for a long time. "How bad is the Aircraft 3 finding?" Bad enough that if it had continued another 6 months, we would have been having a different kind of conversation. He said it plainly, without emphasis, because the fact carried its own weight. The kind with investigators and lawyers and a press conference nobody wants to give. Diana was quiet for a moment. Outside, the fog had pulled back from the bay, and the afternoon light was coming through the bay's high windows at a low angle, catching the metallic surfaces of the disassembled engine in a way that made the space look briefly like something in a painting. "The board gave me 48 hours, she said. Garrison nodded slowly. He had known the shape of this before she said it. He had known it from the text message 4 days ago, and from Donahue's body language, and from the trade publication call, and from the specific way the board's ultimatum had been worded, which was the wording of people who believed they were holding the leverage. "Then we have 47 hours and change," he said. "What do you need me to do?" Diana looked at him with an expression that had moved past the strategic register entirely, past the executive architecture she wore in that building like a second structure. What was underneath it was something that had been building since a Mojave tarmac 3 weeks ago, and a conversation in a hangar doorway at sunset and a late night in a maintenance bay when two people who had both learned to operate alone in difficult conditions had discovered, without looking for it, that certain kinds of silence are easier to sit in when someone else is sitting in them too. "Don't quit," she said. "Whatever happens in the next 48 hours, don't quit." Garrison held her gaze. Around them, the maintenance bay hummed with its own quiet industry, the building systems running their necessary functions, the city outside the windows doing what cities do in the late afternoon when the light is going gold and the fog is waiting offshore for its evening appointment. "I don't quit," he said. "That's not something I do." The 48 hours began at 12:30 on a Wednesday, and Garrison treated them the way he had been trained to treat any operation with a hard extraction window. He identified the objective, assessed the available assets, mapped the threat vectors, and went to work. The objective was simple in its statement and complicated in its execution. Produce documentation sufficient to shift the board's liability calculation from Garrison's presence to Donahue's. The available assets were the maintenance records he had already compiled, the Aircraft 3 finding with Donahue's sign-off, the pattern of deferred repairs across the fleet, and the specific timeline that showed each deferral decision against the corresponding contract schedule it had been made to protect. The threat vectors were Donahue's FAA complaint, the trade publication story that had not yet run, but was being held for what the journalist had described to the communications office as additional sourcing, and the board's 48-hour deadline, which was designed to prevent exactly the kind of systematic documentation Garrison was now assembling. He worked through Wednesday afternoon in the maintenance bay, Marcus beside him, both of them building the evidentiary record with the methodical patience of people who understand that the difference between a complaint and a case is documentation density. Marcus did not ask what it was for. He had worked in the Caldwell building long enough to understand institutional weather, and the weather of the past 72 hours had been specific and readable. Diana spent Wednesday afternoon in her office handling the board's secondary pressure, which arrived in the form of 3 separate phone calls from individual board members who had apparently coordinated their timing. Garrison knew this because Fletcher texted him the update at 2:45 with the concision he had apparently decided was his appropriate register for intelligence delivery. 3 calls in 2 hours. She's holding. At 4:30, Garrison's own phone rang with a number he did not recognize, which resolved when he answered to the voice of a journalist named Caldwell, no relation, from the aviation trade publication. who said she was fact-checking a story about his background and credentials and wanted to give him an opportunity to respond before publication. Her questions were specific in a way that indicated her sourcing was not public record. She knew about Damascus. She knew about the classification. She knew the approximate timeline of his employment at Barstow Daggett. She did not know about Syria or about Diana, which told Garrison that whoever had given her the information had given her the part of the story designed to damage and withheld the part that would complicate the damage. He told her he had no comment at this time and ended the call. He texted Diana, "Story is being filed." Source gave journalist Damascus timeline and classification status. Withheld Syria context deliberately. Publication window is probably 48 to 72 hours. Her response came in under a minute. "I know. Working on it. Don't talk to them." He had not planned to. The evening was where it got harder. Not professionally. The professional dimensions of the situation had a shape he could work with. Problems with identifiable components and addressable solutions. What the evening brought was the other kind of difficulty, the kind that does not respond to documentation or systematic analysis. Lily had a bad night. It started at 8, an hour after he had put her to bed, with the sound he knew better than any other sound in his life, the particular quality of her breathing when the pulmonary pressure was climbing and her body was working harder than it should have to accomplish a function that other 8-year-olds performed without awareness. He was in her room before he had consciously decided to move. She was sitting up in bed with the concentrator running and her hands flat on her knees, the posture she had developed for these episodes, upright and still and focused on her breathing, with a discipline that had no business existing in an 8-year-old, and that broke something in Garrison every time he saw it. The evidence of how much she had already learned to manage alone in the private space of her own body. He sat on the edge of her bed and put his hand on her back and felt the effort in her muscles, the work her small frame was doing. He did not speak. She did not need speech. She needed the specific weight of his hand telling her nervous system that the situation was known and attended to, and that she was not managing it alone. After 20 minutes, her breathing normalized. She leaned against his arm and was asleep in another 10, the way children can sleep, completely and without transition, as though consciousness has simply been switched off by a competent and merciful hand. Garrison stayed for another hour. He sat in the low light of her room, with his hand still on her back, feeling the regular rise and fall of her breathing, and looked at the drawing table by the bay window where the 3 taped-together sheets of paper showed the world as she had mapped it, the Caldwell building, and the aircraft, and the figure at the radio console, and the small watching figure in the corner with the concentrator beside it and the careful printed label, "Me watching." Ellen had watched him the same way, from the corner of whatever room they were in, with the same quality of attention, the particular kind that does not announce itself but is always present, cataloging not the surface of things, but the structure beneath them. He had told her once that it made him feel seen in a way that was occasionally uncomfortable, and she had said that was the point, and they had both understood that she was right. He thought about the letter he had not yet opened, the letter he had carried for 4 years in the same fireproof box as the discharge papers and the Syria photograph and Lily's birth certificate, a folded square of paper in Ellen's handwriting with his name on the outside, left on the kitchen counter in Reno on the morning she had gone to the hospital for the last time. He had picked it up. He had put it in the box. He had not been able to explain to himself, across 4 years, and considerable private examination of the question, exactly why he had not read it. The closest he had come to an explanation was that reading it would make it final in a way that the existence of an unopened letter somehow prevented. The letter was in the box. The box was on the shelf in the closet of his bedroom, 12 feet away. He stayed with Lily until 2 in the morning. Then he went to his room. He stood in front of the closet for a while. He did not open the box. He went back to his laptop and worked on the documentation until 4. Thursday arrived gray and close. The fog consolidated against the city with the commitment it brought on its serious days. The bay invisible from the building's windows, the bridges reduced to their lower sections, and the suggestion of their upper ones. Garrison was at his desk on the 39th floor at 7:15, which was earlier than anyone else on the floor except the overnight security staff, whose shift change he had timed his arrival against to avoid the lobby conversation that his presence at 7 in the morning would otherwise generate. The documentation package was complete. 14 months of maintenance records cross-referenced against contract schedules. 6 specific decisions by Donahue to defer critical inspections within 2 weeks of a contract delivery date. The Aircraft 7 pressure sensor. The Aircraft 11 hydraulic fault. The Aircraft 3 turbine deviation with its June sign-off. And the piece that Marcus had found on Tuesday, which Garrison had held back from the preliminary report because he had wanted to verify it fully before including it. A service record from March of the previous year, 18 months before Garrison's arrival, showing that a junior technician named Webb had flagged the same hydraulic issue on Aircraft 11 and had been transferred to the Ground Equipment Division within 3 weeks of filing the flag. Webb was still employed at Caldwell. He worked in the Ground Equipment Division on the 2nd floor. He had not spoken to anyone in the Aviation Division since his transfer. Garrison had not approached him. Not yet. Diana arrived at 8. She came to his office rather than hers, which had become the pattern of the past week without either of them having established it as a pattern. She closed the door and looked at the documentation on his screen and read through it with the focused speed of someone who processes dense information without losing resolution. When she finished, she sat back and was quiet for a moment. "Webb," she said, "still here, 2nd floor." He filed the flag, got transferred. If Donahue knew about the hydraulic fault 18 months ago and buried a technician's report rather than addressing it, that changes the nature of the FAA complaint significantly. It changes everything significantly. Donahue can argue that your intervention on Aircraft 11 was unauthorized. Diana's voice was level and thinking out loud simultaneously. He cannot argue that position if it's established that the fault you responded to was the direct result of a report he suppressed. No, Garrison agreed. He cannot. Diana looked at the closed door of the office. Outside it, the floor was beginning to populate with the morning arrivals, the ambient sounds of a working building coming to life. I need to talk to Webb before Donahue does. Donahue doesn't know about the March record yet. I found it in the archive files, not the active maintenance system. He may not remember it exists. Or he's counting on the fact that no one would look that far back. Diana stood. I'll go to the 2nd floor myself. Don't send anything to the board yet. Not until I've spoken to him. She left. Garrison turned back to his screen and added the web transfer documentation to the package, dated and sourced, and saved 3 copies to different locations with the systematic redundancy of someone who does not trust single points of failure. At 9:47, his phone rang. UCLA Medical, Dr. Bryce. Lily's morning monitoring data, transmitted automatically from the home concentrator to the hospital's remote monitoring system, had shown an anomalous pressure spike at 3:14 in the morning, duration 11 minutes, magnitude sufficient to require documentation under her care protocol. Dr. Bryce wanted Garrison to bring Lily in for an unscheduled evaluation that afternoon. The spike was likely not indicative of acute deterioration, but the pre-surgical workup timeline required that any anomalous readings be formally assessed before the implantation procedure could proceed. Garrison wrote down the appointment time, 3 o'clock. He looked at the clock on his screen. 6 hours and change. He texted Diana. Lily needs a clinic appointment at 3. I'll be back by 5. Her response, go. I've got Webb. He had not told Diana about the bad night. He had not described the 20 minutes on Lily's bed, or the hour in the low light, or the drawing table with the 3 sheets of paper. He had texted the appointment information, and she had responded with 2 words, and he had understood from those 2 words that she had understood more than he had sent, which was something he was still adjusting to. The specific experience of being read accurately by someone who was paying that quality of attention. At 11:15, Fletcher appeared in the doorway of Garrison's office with the expression of someone delivering information they would prefer not to be delivering. The trade publication story had been posted online, not in 48 to 72 hours, now. Someone had pushed the publication window forward, which meant someone with access to the publication's editorial process had applied pressure in a specific direction. The headline was, Caldwell Aerospace, CEO employs ghost operative with erased federal record. What is she hiding? The story was accurate in its facts and dishonest in its framing, which is the most effective kind of damaging journalism. It reported Garrison's classified background and the deletion of his service record from accessible databases correctly. It reported the Aircraft 11 radio intervention and described it as unauthorized interference in a commercial aviation emergency. It quoted an unnamed source described as a senior Caldwell engineering official expressing concern about the company's vetting processes. It did not mention Syria. It did not mention Damascus, or the extraction, or the nature of the mission, or the civilian life that had been at stake. It contained one sentence that Garrison read twice. Sources indicate the CEO's relationship with the employee may extend beyond a professional capacity, raising questions about the basis for his hire. He read the story once, closed the browser, and did not read it again. At 12:40, Diana called him. Her voice was controlled with the specific effort of someone managing something that has broken a boundary they had maintained for a long time. The board had convened an emergency session. The story had given them what they needed to move from pressure to ultimatum. They were not asking for Garrison's resignation as a condition of Diana retaining her position. They were voting on her removal entirely if she did not produce, by 9 o'clock Friday morning, either Garrison's resignation letter or a legal justification for his continued employment sufficient to neutralize the FAA complaint and the publication liability. Webb talked, Diana said. There was something underneath her controlled voice that Garrison identified as the specific exhaustion of someone who has been fighting on multiple fronts for too long and has just received news that the fight is not yet close to over. He confirmed everything. Donahue saw his flag in March, transferred him within 3 weeks. Webb kept a copy of his original report, personal copy. He's had it for 18 months. That's the case, Garrison said. I know it's the case. The board's lawyers will argue timeline and jurisdiction for 6 months while they vote me out tomorrow morning. A pause. I need tonight to build the legal response. I need you to... She stopped. Garrison waited. I need you to not disappear, she said. The sentence arrived stripped of its professional register entirely, without the executive architecture, without the composure she maintained in that building like structural load-bearing. Just the sentence and the person who needed to say it. He told her he would be back by 5. He took Lily to UCLA at 3. Doctor. Bryce was thorough and unhurried, the qualities Garrison valued most in physicians, and her examination confirmed that the overnight episode was consistent with the exertion pattern of the previous weeks, rather than indicative of acute change. Lily's baseline was holding. The pre-surgical workup could proceed as scheduled. The implantation date remained the following Wednesday, 7 days away. Lily sat on the examination table during the assessment with her hands folded in her lap and asked Dr. Bryce 3 questions: whether the device would be visible from the outside, whether she would be able to run after it was implanted, and whether the butterfly stickers could be moved to her new equipment or whether they would lose their adhesive. Dr. Bryce answered all 3 questions with the seriousness they deserved. The device would not be visible. Running would be possible and encouraged. The sticker adhesive question was outside her expertise, but she would consult with the nursing team. In the corridor afterward, while Lily was in the restroom, Garrison stood against the wall and looked at the ceiling and was still for 30 seconds in the way he permitted himself to be still when there were no witnesses to the cost of the preceding hours. Then he took a breath and straightened and went to collect his daughter. In the car, driving back across the city through the Thursday afternoon traffic with the fog beginning its evening advance from the west, Lily was quiet in a way that was different from her usual quiet. She was looking out the window at the city with the concentrated attention she brought to things she was filing away for later consideration. After several blocks, she said, "Is your job going to be okay?" He looked at her in the rearview mirror. "People at school talk about stuff they see online," she said. "Amber showed me something on her mom's phone about you and the lady whose plane broke." He drove for another block before answering. "It's being worked on," he said. "Is the lady helping?" "Yes." Lily looked out the window again. A minute passed. "Mom would have liked her," Lily said. "She's the kind of person Mom liked, the kind that does things instead of just talking about doing things." Garrison kept his eyes on the road. The city moved past the windows in its evening configuration, the lights coming on in the buildings, the bay just visible at the cross streets, the fog arriving at the edges of the western neighborhoods with its patient, obliterating patience. At 5:05, he was back in the Caldwell building. Diana was in the operations center, surrounded by the legal team's documentation, her blazer off for the first time he had seen in the building. Her sleeves rolled, her hair slightly less arranged than its morning configuration. She looked up when he came through the door, and something in her face adjusted in a way that she did not appear to notice. He sat across the table from her and opened his laptop. They worked until 11. The legal team produced 3 drafts of the response document, and Garrison revised the technical sections of each with the precision of someone who has spent enough time in institutional proceedings to understand exactly which facts carry legal weight and exactly how they need to be stated to carry it in writing. Diana worked the structural argument, the case law references, the board governance framework. The documentation package grew into something that had an architecture, a logic that moved from evidence to conclusion without gaps that a board's attorney could drive a defense through. At 11, the legal team left. The operations center emptied. The building went to its nighttime configuration, the overhead lights cycling to their reduced setting. the ambient sounds dropping to the low register of ventilation systems and the distant city. Garrison closed his laptop and looked across the table. Diana had her hands flat on the surface in front of her, looking at the documents, and was very still in the way of someone at the end of a long expenditure of effort who has not yet permitted themselves to assess the outcome. He got up, went to the small kitchen at the end of the operations center, found 2 cups that were not paper, and made coffee from the good machine that the overnight staff used because the daytime staff never stayed late enough to justify it. He brought the cups back and set one in front of her without asking. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him. Then she picked up the cup. "Lily," she said. "How is she?" He told her about the appointment, the baseline holding, the Wednesday timeline intact, the sticker adhesive question that had been escalated to the nursing team. Diana set her cup down and covered her face with both hands for exactly 3 seconds. The duration of something that needed to be private, finding the only privacy available in a glass-walled operations center in the middle of a San Francisco high-rise at 11 at night. Then her hands came down and she picked up the cup again. "We'll know by 9 tomorrow morning," she said. Garrison nodded. Outside the windows, the fog had completed its work on the city, the bay entirely gone, the bridge lights reduced to their lowest suggestion, San Francisco existing in its nighttime form as a series of illuminated intentions in the gray. He reached into his jacket pocket. The fireproof box was at home, but the letter had been in his jacket pocket since this morning, when he had finally taken it out of the box before leaving the apartment, unable to explain the decision to himself, except as the acknowledgement that he had been carrying the weight of the unopened thing for long enough, and that the time for it had arrived. He set it on the table. Diana looked at it and understood immediately what it was without being told, because she had been paying that quality of attention for 3 weeks, and the handwriting on the outside was a woman's handwriting, and it was addressed to Garrison in the specific way of someone who knew him completely. "I haven't read it," he said. She did not say anything. He opened it. The paper was folded in thirds, the crease lines soft from 4 years in the box. Ellen's handwriting was even and clear, the handwriting of someone who had decided what they wanted to say before they picked up the pen. He read it in the silence of the nighttime operations center with Diana across the table, not looking at him, giving him the privacy of her averted eyes while remaining exactly present enough that he was not alone with it. When he finished, he set it down. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, to the room and to the fog outside, and to the woman across the table who was not looking at him, and to the woman whose handwriting was on the page, and to the version of himself that had been carrying the unopened weight of it for 4 years. She knew. Diana looked at him then. "She knew I would wait too long to read it," he said. "She wrote it for the moment I finally did, not for when she left. For now." He did not read it aloud, but he held it for another moment before folding it back along its creases and putting it in his jacket pocket, where it would stay, readable now, available now, no longer the weight of something sealed, but the weight of something known. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass with its indifferent and patient force. 9 o'clock was 9 hours away. He picked up his coffee and Diana picked up hers, and they sat in the nighttime operations center of a building that was going to look different in the morning depending on what 9 board members decided in a room Garrison had never been in. And the work they had done was either sufficient or it was not. And either way, the fog outside was going to lift by noon the way it always did, and Lily's appointment was still Wednesday, and Ellen's letter was in his pocket. He had told Diana he didn't quit. That was not something he did. 9 o'clock arrived the way deadlines always arrive, not as a single moment, but as the accumulation of everything that preceded it, becoming suddenly present and accountable. Garrison was in the operations center at 7:15. The documentation package had been delivered to the board's legal counsel at 6:45 by the Caldwell legal team, hand-delivered in physical form and transmitted digitally simultaneously. The redundancy deliberate. The package ran to 214 pages. The executive summary was 4 paragraphs. The 4 paragraphs contained everything a board member needed to understand what Preston Donahue had been doing for 18 months and what the cost of continuing to protect him would be measured in, not in dollars, but in the specific legal and regulatory currency that board members understand most viscerally. Deanna was in the boardroom on the 42nd floor. Garrison waited. Marcus brought coffee at 7:40 and set it on the desk without comment, which was the correct instinct. Fletcher appeared at 8:15 and stood in the doorway of the operations center for a moment, not entering, just present in the specific way of someone who wants to register that they are aware of what is at stake without making it about themselves. Garrison nodded at him. Fletcher nodded back and left. At 8:52, the demonstration flight was scheduled to depart. It had been on the calendar for 6 weeks. 40-minute showcase flight over the Bay Area for a Department of Defense procurement committee, 7 officials plus support staff, Aircraft 9 carrying the full demonstration payload. The contract under consideration was the largest single award in Caldwell's history, larger than the Apex acquisition in its annual revenue implications, the kind of contract that determined a company's trajectory for the following decade. Diana had known when she scheduled the board meeting deadline that it would fall on the same morning as the demonstration flight. Garrison had understood, without being told, that this was not a coincidence, but a calculation. If the board voted her out at 9, the demonstration flight would be captained by a company in transition, its CEO replaced or embattled, its credibility with a federal procurement committee immediately and significantly compromised. The board knew this too. That was the other part of the calculation. At 8:47, Aircraft 9 pushed back from the Caldwell private terminal at SFO Garrison watched the pushback on the Operations Center's ground movement display with the particular quality of attention he brought to things that were not yet problems but contained the conditions for becoming problems. The weather was clear. The bay was visible from the windows for the first time in 3 days, the fog having retreated overnight to a thin band on the western horizon. The Golden Gate was fully present in the morning light, its towers exact and red above the dark water. At 8:59, 3 things happened in a sequence so compressed that Garrison's mind processed them almost simultaneously. His phone showed a text from Deanna. Board is voting. 1 minute. The Operations Center radio crackened with Aircraft 9's frequency, and the hydraulic pressure display on the secondary monitoring console, the one that ran the passive telemetry feed from all active Caldwell aircraft, showed Aircraft 9's primary hydraulic circuit dropping. Not anomalous, not ambiguous. Dropping with the specific profile that Garrison had spent 3 nights learning to recognize in the Aircraft 11 data. The same signature, the same rate, the same pattern of a line failure in progress at altitude. Aircraft 9 had 31,000 feet beneath it, and a Department of Defense procurement committee in its cabin, and a hydraulic system that was failing in a manner that the aircraft's own warning systems had not yet flagged because the threshold parameters had been set during Aircraft 9's last maintenance review, signed off by Preston Donahue, calibrated to a tolerance that accommodated the kind of degraded performance that should not be accommodated. Garrison was at the communications console before the thought completed itself. He identified himself to the pilot, Captain Reese, by name and role, and stated the situation in 4 sentences. Primary hydraulic pressure dropping, current rate of loss, projected time to critical threshold, and the specific nature of the failure based on the Aircraft 11 precedent. Reese was a 15-year pilot with the controlled voice of someone who is trained for this and the specific quality of alertness in his response that told Garrison he was dealing with someone who would follow precise instruction without requiring it to be argued. The operations center around Garrison had gone completely still. Marcus was standing 3 feet away, not moving. 2 other staff members had stopped what they were doing. Everyone in the room understood what the display was showing and what the voice on the radio was doing, and that the distance between those 2 things was the distance between one outcome and another. Garrison walked Reese through the isolation procedure, not the protocol binder version, the field version, the one that existed in the gap between what the manual described and what the aircraft's actual hydraulic architecture permitted when you understood the system at the component level rather than the schematic level. He directed the pressure redistribution to the primary flight control circuits, instructing Reese to accept the reduced nose-wheel steering responsiveness that would result as the cost of preserving the control authority he would need for the approach. At 31,000 feet, the isolation held. At 22,000, descending on vectors for SFO's runway 28 left. The secondary circuit showed a second pressure drop, smaller than the first, but confirmation that the line failure was propagating rather than stable. Garrison did not change his voice. He directed a further isolation, accepting the loss of the thrust reverser actuation system on the starboard engine as the next cost, instructing Reese to plan for a longer rollout and coordinating with SFO approach control, who had already been notified and had cleared runway 28 left, as exclusive emergency equipment standing by. The cabin, Reese reported at 15,000 feet, was calm. The procurement committee had been informed of a hydraulic advisory requiring a precautionary approach. The word precautionary was doing significant work in that sentence. At 8,000 feet, Garrison said, "Gear will be manual. I'll call each step. You confirm before you act. We have enough pressure in the isolated circuit to support the landing sequence if we do this in order. Don't rush any step." Reese said, "Copy. Ready." They did it in order. The nose wheel came down at 400 feet above the threshold, 12 seconds later than standard, and locked with the confirmation tone that was the specific sound of a variable resolved. The aircraft crossed the threshold with full control authority, touched down on the main gear with the precision of a pilot who had just spent 22 minutes performing the most demanding approach of his career with absolute focus, and rolled out long on the cleared runway with the brake system working harder than it was designed to work and doing it. Full stop. All souls. The operations center was silent for 3 seconds after Reese transmitted the confirmation. Then it was not silent. Garrison set down the headset and turned to the monitoring console and began pulling the post-incident data with the systematic attention of someone who knows the next phase of work begins the moment the crisis phase ends. The documentation of what had just happened needed to exist in complete, accurate form before anyone had the opportunity to shape the narrative of it in a less complete or less accurate direction. Marcus was already pulling the pre-flight records for Aircraft 9. His face had the expression of someone who has just understood, in a way that moves past intellectual comprehension into something more permanent, what the work they are doing actually means. Garrison's phone showed 4 missed calls from the board's communications line, all in the past 6 minutes. He did not return them. He called Diana. She answered on the first ring. Behind her voice, he could hear the ambient sound of the boardroom, multiple voices. the specific acoustic texture of a large, formal room in a state of disruption. He told her what had happened with Aircraft 9. He told her all of it, clearly and in sequence: the hydraulic signature, the isolation procedure, the manual gear extension, the full stop. He told her that the post-incident documentation was being assembled now and would be complete within the hour. He told her that Aircraft 9's maintenance records showed Donahue's sign-off on the hydraulic threshold parameters that had failed to trigger the automatic warning that should have caught this before the aircraft ever left the ground. Diana was quiet for 4 seconds. Then she said, "Stay there." The boardroom door opened. He could hear it through the phone, her heels on the floor. The sound of a room that had been conducting one kind of business being redirected to another kind by a single person's entrance, and the specific authority of what she was carrying when she walked back in. He heard her voice begin, directed not at him but at the room, and the quality of it was different from any version of her voice he had yet encountered. Not the controlled professional register or the careful personal one, but something underneath both of those. The voice of someone who has been told that the ground they are standing on is insufficient and has chosen to create ground rather than look for somewhere else to stand. He set the phone on the console beside him and let it run and went back to the documentation. 3 hours later, the journalist who had published the morning story sent Diana's communications office a single follow-up question. Was the civilian national extracted in Syria in 2018 affiliated with Caldwell Aerospace? Diana's communications director forwarded it to her. She read it once, set her phone face down on the table, and did not respond. Some things belonged to the people they had happened to, and to no one else. 40 minutes later, Diana walked into the operations center. She was still in her board meeting clothes, the dark blazer that she wore for formal occasions, and she looked like someone who had just completed something that had required everything available to her and had come out the other side still standing, which is a different quality of standing than the standing you do when things have gone as planned. She looked at the monitoring console, at the post-incident report taking shape on Garrison's screen, at Marcus, who was building the pre-flight records comparison with the focused speed of someone who understands that his work is load-bearing. 9-0, she said. Garrison looked at her. The board vote. Her voice was level. After the Aircraft 9 report came through the operations line, the 3 members who were carrying Donahue's position withdrew their objections. The vote was 9-0 to retain current executive leadership and refer the Donahue matter to the FAA and the company's legal counsel for full investigation. She crossed the room and stood beside him at the console, looking at the documentation on his screen, close enough that he could have reached out and touched her arm, which he did not do, and which both of them were aware he did not do. Donahue is in his office, she said. Building security, has his badge on restricted status. He is not going anywhere. Colonel Holt Reeves arrived at the Caldwell building at 2 in the afternoon, which was earlier than Garrison had expected and later than the situation had been requiring. He came through the lobby in civilian clothes, the quiet, well-maintained clothing of a retired military officer who no longer needs the uniform to communicate what he is, and rode the elevator to the 39th floor and found Garrison in the operations center with the directness of a man who has navigated more complex terrain. Reeves was 67, lean and deliberate, with a face that had spent decades in the specific weather of command responsibility. He shook Garrison's hand with the grip of someone for whom the handshake still meant something, and looked at him with the eyes of a man taking an assessment that he has been preparing for some time. "You look like you've been awake for 30 hours, Reeves said. 26. Close enough. Reeves looked around the operations center, at the monitoring displays and the documentation spread across the tables, and the two technicians still working at the far end of the room. "Tell me what you need." What Garrison needed was the piece of the documentation that only Reeves could provide. The classified operational record of the Damascus extraction, not the full record, which remained classified and would remain classified, but the specific elements that could be released under the declassification review that Reeves had quietly initiated 3 weeks ago through channels that Garrison had not known he was using until Reeves told him on the 4 a.m. phone call that now felt like it had happened in a different month. The Silver Star recommendation that had been submitted in 2018 and had been held at the classification level of the operation ever since. The commendation language. The operational summary that described, in terms that could be released without compromising sources or methods, the nature of the mission and the specific actions for which the commendation had been recommended. Reeves had brought it in a manila envelope. He set it on the table. Garrison looked at the envelope for a moment. "The department confirmed declassification this morning," Reeves said. "The review was completed 2 weeks ago. I was waiting for the right moment." A pause that contained several things. This seemed like the right moment. Diana held the press conference at 4:30. She held it in the Caldwell Building's main lobby, which had the marble floor and the high ceilings and the quality of light that corporate architects designed to communicate permanence and credibility, and which on this particular afternoon was doing both of those things in service of something that had nothing to do with its original intention. The aviation trade journalists were there, including the one who had published the morning story, who was standing in the second row with the expression of someone who was beginning to understand that the story she published at 11 a.m. has been substantially superseded by events, defense correspondents, technology reporters. The building's lobby was at capacity. Diana stood at the single podium without notes. She began with Aircraft 9. She described what had happened in the operations center that morning with the specific and unsparing accuracy of a CEO who has decided that the most powerful available position is complete transparency delivered without apology. She named the hydraulic fault. She named the certification threshold that should have flagged it. She named the person who had set that threshold. She presented the documentation of Donahue's 18 months of deferred inspections and suppressed reports, the web transfer, the Aircraft 11 precedent, the Aircraft 3 turbine finding, the Aircraft 7 pressure sensor, laid out in sequence with the clarity of someone who has spent a night building a case and a morning watching it prove itself. Then she said, "The man who guided Aircraft 9 to a safe landing this morning, with 31 people aboard, including 7 federal officials, is the same man Preston Donahue filed a false complaint against 48 hours ago. I want to tell you who that man is." She told them. She did not tell them everything. She told them what could be told, what Reeves had released, what Garrison had agreed could be said. She told them about the Army Rangers and the classification and the operation in Syria in 2018, described in the operational summary's careful, releasable language as a hostage rescue mission resulting in the safe extraction of a civilian American national. She did not say it was her. That detail she kept because it was hers and because its absence made what she was saying about Garrison stand entirely on its own, without the personal debt framing that Garrison had refused from the beginning. She said, "Garrison Mercer has spent the past 6 years being invisible because his service required it, and then because life required it, and then because loss required it. He came to work for this company 3 weeks ago, and in 3 weeks, he identified 6 systemic safety failures, documented 18 months of deliberate concealment, and this morning, without authorization and without hesitation, did the only thing that mattered when 31 people needed someone who actually knew what they were doing. She paused. The Silver Star he was awarded in 2018 was held at the classification level of his operation. As of this morning, that classification has been lifted. Colonel Holt Reeves stepped forward from the side of the lobby where he had been standing in his civilian clothes. And he was not in civilian clothes anymore. He had changed in the building's executive suite in the 20 minutes before the press conference, and he was in full dress uniform with the quiet and absolute authority of a man who wears it because it is the honest account of what he has done and who he is. He pinned the Silver Star to Garrison's chest in the lobby of a corporate building in San Francisco on a Friday afternoon in November, in front of journalists and staff and the 7 members of the Department of Defense Procurement Committee who had been in the aircraft that morning and had come directly from SFO to this building because they had been told something was happening that they should see. The lobby was silent for the 3 seconds it took Reeves to complete the pin and step back. Then it was not silent. Garrison stood at attention in the way that is not performed, but simply is, the posture of a body that has been trained to a standard it never fully releases regardless of what it is wearing, and looked at a point on the far wall of the lobby, while the sound of the room did what it did, and did not look at the cameras, or the journalists, or the procurement officials, or Diana, who was standing 6 feet to his left, with her hands clasped in front of her, and the expression of someone watching something be completed that has been waiting a long time to be completed. He looked at the lobby wall. He thought about Lily, who was at school 4 miles away, and did not yet know about the morning, and would hear about it first from him tonight in the specific version he would construct for an 8-year-old who understood more than most adults, but deserved to hear her father's day in her father's words. He thought about Ellen's letter in his jacket pocket, readable now, known now. Its weight transformed from the weight of something sealed to the weight of something carried forward. He thought about a basement in Syria in 2018, and a woman he had pulled out of the dark and put on a helicopter and not seen again for 6 years. He thought about the Mojave Desert and a cracked tarmac and a $70 million aircraft, and the specific quality of light at 1 in the afternoon when the heat is absolute and everything that happens because there is no other option. Reeves caught his eye. The slight nod of a man communicating, without words, that the accounting is complete. That the debt the military owes to the men it sends into the dark without acknowledgement has been, in this specific instance, partially and imperfectly, but genuinely paid. Garrison returned the nod. The lobby continued its noise around him, and he stood in the center of it, still and present, the Silver Star on his chest, catching the afternoon light that came through the building's high lobby windows. The same light that would reach San Francisco's Sunset District in another hour and fall through the bay window where Lily's drawing table was positioned, where 3 taped-together sheets of paper showed the world as she had mapped it. He, watching. He picked Lily up from school at 3:30. She came through the gate with her backpack listing slightly to the left, the way it always did when she had put too many books in the main compartment and not enough in the front pocket. A structural problem he had pointed out 11 times, and that she had 11 times acknowledged and not corrected, because the specific arrangement of her books was, apparently, non-negotiable. The concentrator rolled behind her on its wheels, the dragonfly sticker catching the afternoon light. She saw his face and stopped walking for 1 second before she reached him. Then she covered the remaining distance and put her arms around his waist and held on with the particular force of a child who has learned to read adult weather with precision and who understood, without being told, that today had been something. He put his hand on the back of her head. They stood there on the sidewalk outside the school gate, while the other parents and children moved around them. The ordinary traffic of an ordinary Friday afternoon in a neighborhood that did not know what had happened that morning 4 miles away in a marble lobby, and Garrison let the moment be exactly what it was, nothing managed or abbreviated, just his daughter's arms around him and the city doing its quiet work in every direction. In the car he told her, not all of it, the version built for her, which was also the true version, just shaped for the person receiving it. He told her about the aircraft and the radio and the 31 people and the landing. He told her about the medal. He told her that some things that had been hidden for a long time were not hidden anymore. Lily listened without interrupting, which was her mode for things she was filing at the deepest level. When he finished, she looked out the window at the passing streets. "Mom knew," she said. "That's what the letter said, isn't it?" He looked at her in the rearview mirror. "You read it this morning," she said. "Before you left, I heard the box." He drove for a block before answering. "Yeah," he said. "She knew." Lily nodded slowly, with the gravity of someone completing a calculation that has been running for a long time. "She always knew everything first," she said, and there was no sadness in it, only the particular pride of a daughter describing a mother she had understood, and would continue to understand, across whatever distance existed between them now. They stopped for tacos. Not because it was a celebration, though it was, but because it was Friday, and Friday was tacos. And some structures matter precisely because they do not bend to circumstance. Diana came to the apartment that evening. She brought nothing, arrived without announcement, knocked once. She was in the same clothes as the press conference, the dark blazer, but something in how she wore them had changed. The professional architecture slightly loosened in a way that had become more frequent over the past weeks, and that Garrison had stopped noting as unusual because it had become simply how she was when she was here. Lily was at the drawing table when Diana arrived, adding to the 3 sheets of paper. She looked up and said, with the matter-of-fact warmth she had extended to Diana from the beginning, as though she had made a private determination early and had not revised it since, "You can see what I added if you want." Diana went to the drawing table and looked. Lily had added the lobby, rendered in her architectural style, the high windows, the marble floor suggested by parallel lines, a crowd indicated by a cluster of small figures. At the center, 2 figures of notably different heights standing close together. Above the taller one, in careful printing, "Dad," a small star shape drawn on his chest. Above the other figure, added in slightly newer pencil, less certain but present, "Deanna." Diana looked at the drawing for a long moment. Then she looked at Lily. Lily had already turned back to her work, the completed observation filed. Her attention returned to the next thing, the way she moved through the world with the forward momentum of someone who has learned that the present moment is where everything actually happens. Diana straightened and found Garrison in the kitchen doorway. He had been watching. He did not look away when she saw him. Outside the bay window, the fog had come in with its evening commitment, the city softening at its edges, the last light somewhere behind the gray doing its final work before dark. The concentrator hummed beside Lily's table. Ellen's photograph caught the last of the kitchen light from the windowsill. Garrison said, "Stay for dinner." It was not a large thing to say. It was, in the way of certain small sentences that arrive after a long sequence of larger ones, exactly sufficient. Diana looked at him with the expression she had stopped managing in his presence sometime in the past week, the one that existed below the executive register and the careful composure, and the 4 years of operating alone at altitude, the expression of someone who has been seen accurately by another person and has decided, against considerable prior habit, to allow it. "Yeah," she said. "Okay." Lily did not look up from her drawing, but the small sound she made, quiet and satisfied, suggested she had been waiting for that answer for longer than the question had existed. 4 months later, on a Saturday morning in late March when the fog had stayed offshore, and the light over the bay was the particular clean gold that San Francisco produces without warning and without apology, Garrison Mercer stood at the edge of a path in Golden Gate Park and watched his daughter run. Not walk, not move carefully, with one hand on the concentrator's handle and the other monitoring the tubing. Run. The way 8-year-olds run when nothing is holding them back, and the ground is flat, and the air is cool, and the body has been waiting a long time for permission to simply go. The concentrator was not there. It was in the apartment on Irving Street, beside the drawing table, no longer needed in the way it had been needed, its job completed by a device smaller than a deck of cards that Lily had named, after considerable deliberation, Gerald. Garrison watched her reach the far end of the path and turn and come back, her arms pumping, her face entirely occupied by the business of running, and did not attempt to manage what was happening in his own face, because there was no one nearby whose opinion of it concerned him. Diana was standing 3 feet to his left. She had arrived at the apartment that morning with coffee from the place on Irving that Lily had rated 46 out of 50, which Lily had immediately upgraded to 48 upon Diana's arrival on the grounds that bringing coffee without being asked warranted a 2-point bonus under the atmosphere of not being weird about us criterion. Diana had accepted this scoring adjustment without comment. She was not in a blazer. She had stopped wearing blazers to the apartment sometime in January, a transition so gradual that Garrison could not have identified the specific date, only that it had happened and that it was accurate. Lily reached them and stopped, hands on her knees, breathing hard in the way of someone whose lungs are doing the work they were always supposed to do. She looked up at her father, then at Diana, then back at her father. "Gerald is working," she said, with the matter-of-fact satisfaction of an engineer confirming a successful systems test. Garrison crouched down to her level. "Yeah," he said, "Gerald's working." Lily straightened, assessed the path ahead, and ran again. Garrison stood. The bay was visible through the tree line, flat and silver in the morning light. Somewhere in the operations center on Beale Street, Marcus was running the Saturday inspection rotation that he now led without supervision. Reeves had called Thursday to say the Veterans Aviation Training Program had received its first federal funding approval. The Department of Defense contract had been awarded to Caldwell the previous month, the Procurement Committee's recommendation unanimous. Diana's hand found his without announcement, her fingers settling between his with the ease of something that has found the correct position after a long search. He did not look at her. She did not look at him. They both watched Lily run. Ellen's letter was in his jacket pocket. It was always in his jacket pocket now, the paper soft from folding and unfolding, readable at any time, available at any time, no longer a weight, but a presence. The kind that does not require acknowledgement to be felt. Down the path, Lily had reached the far end again and was turning. She raised one hand above her head without breaking stride, the wave of someone who knows exactly where her people are and wants them to know she knows. Garrison raised two fingers. Some debts cannot be invoiced. Some rescues happen years after the dark. Some men spend a long time being invisible before the right person looks in the right direction and sees exactly who is standing there. Gerald was working. Lily was running. The fog stayed offshore. That was enough. That was everything.